Welcome back to the next chapter of our in-depth exploration of The Beast Arises, I Am Slaughter. The grim darkness of the Warhammer 40K universe is becoming even more perilous as the Imperial Fists face mounting challenges on Ardermantua and in the cold void of space. In this chapter, we plunge deeper into the chaos of the Chrome's Nest, where survival is uncertain and every step could lead to disaster. Last time, we saw Captain Slaughter and his squad battle through the rain-soaked nightmare of the Blister Nest. They fought off wave after wave of Chromes, yet the threat keeps escalating. Meanwhile, in orbit, the Imperial fleet is unraveling under the strain of mysterious gravitational anomalies, and a strike cruiser has fallen, its fate unknown. The Chromes are proving to be more than a simple Xenos threat. But just how far does their reach extend? In the upcoming chapter, we'll see the Imperial Fists pushed to their limits as the true scale of the enemy begins to reveal itself. With every clash of bolter and blade, the Chromes grow bolder, and the Imperial forces must face the terrifying reality that they are not as prepared as they thought. Prepare yourself for intense action, deeper revelations, and the ever-growing tension between the defenders of humanity and the alien threat. As the story unfolds, we'll also see more from Terra, where political machinations continue to shape the fate of the galaxy. The Emperor's servants may be mighty, but in the face of this growing danger, even they may falter. The stakes are higher than ever, and the survival of the Imperium hangs in the balance. Let's continue the journey with Chapter 13 of The Beast Arises, I Am Slaughter. Chapter 13. Chapter 13, Terror, Tashkent Hive. "You look unhappy," remarked Esad Wire. "Do I?" replied Vangrich. "Do I really? You can tell that?" Wire shook his head. "No, you can't read that enough face." "Not for certain," he admitted. "You can't treat that enough face," "Not for certain," he admitted. "You can't treat anything enough face, for certain." He stared at Vangerich for a moment, Vangerich just standing there in the doorway of the monitor station control room like a shadow broadened by the dusk, and considered him carefully. "Been a very long time besides," Wire added, "a long time not seeing your face. I'm no longer familiar with its nuances. I wouldn't know what sadness looked like anyway, even if I could read it for sure." Wire rose from his worn never seat, brushing imaginary lint from his double-breasted arbiter jacket. "A long time," he said, an echo spoken only to himself. Vangerich was still in the doorway. Wire beckoned him. "You can come in, sir," he said. "Come right in. Or do you have to be invited over the threshold like a night ghoul?" Vangerich stepped inside the control room. It was brightly lit, too brightly lit, the hard shine of the lamp globes and spots revealing every fatigued edge and scuffed facier of the control suite. The dials and levers worn by centuries of hands, the milky readouts, the chattering banks of antiquated switches, the electric notice boards with their mechanical letters and series lights that stated the days, crimes, and actions, and every few minutes reshuffled and revised, like the journey monitors at transit stations. Monitor Station KVF, Division 134, Sub-12, Arbitrator. It had taken Vangerich 4 hours to get there, an hour's flight east from the palace by suborbital, then a 3-hour descent into the underhives of Tashkent Spire, a journey of rattling lift cages, suspension platforms, and dank hallways. It had taken Esad Wire a great deal longer to reach Moneta Station KVF. After his past life was laundered and washed clean, 3 years at Adeptus Arbitrator INSEP training, 2 more at the Procedural Division in the Asiatic Domes, and then 8 years with Tashkent Major Case and another 6 at a Jurisdiction Subcommander. Then he got the Sector Overseer star to pin on his jacket and a monitor control room full of antiquated switches. Everything was processed, everything formalized, every crime had to be cataloged and filed, described and posted, and redirected to the appropriate division. It was a ritualized system that had never really coped with the actuality of real life and real crime in the vast hive, but it was considered the optimal solution and thus persevered with. Running the data switching station was also considered a task of great responsibility, and thus always awarded to a man of significance or ability as a mark of promotion. Awarded to a man of significance or ability as a mark of promotion. SR. Dwyer was not a law enforcer. He did not fight crime. He simply filed it. The room was essentially automated. Dwyer made a gesture, and 2 junior arbiters, the only other living people present, went off to find duties in adjacent chambers. "You look unhappy," said Vangerich. "After all this time, that's the beginning of your conversation." Dwyer shrugged. "It struck me as so," he said. "How has life treated you since you left the officio?" Vangerich asked. He did not look at Dwyer. He studied the chattering updating lines of tile type that were rattling up and down the displays. "One never really leaves the officio, sir," Dwyer replied with a half-smile. "No need for the sir," said Vangerich. Dwyer shook his head. "I think so. You are a man of a certain position in life and the world, and I am another of another position. The inequality of our states seems to indicate I should call you that." "It's good to see you, beast," said Vangerich. "And you, sir." Dwyer grinned. "Damn, I haven't been called that in a long time." He walked to the side cupboard and poured 2 mugs of thick black caffeine from a jug. He handed one to the Grandmaster. "Social call, is it?" "Been a couple of decades about time I visited," I said. "I've wanted to before many times," said Van Garrett with surprising directness, "never been appropriate." "Is it now?" "No, but I did it anyway. I needed to get out. I needed to converse with someone who wasn't anything to do with anything at the palace." "Find a priest," suggested Dwyer, "a confessor." "The priests all have agendas," replied Vangerich. "So? You're here? Go on." "Little men," said Vangerich, taking a seat at one of the monitor stations and sipping his caffeine. "Little men playing at being high lords. Personal ambition is in danger of costing the Imperium very dearly. I tried to block it, but the officio doesn't have a clout it once wielded, and I got played. Lansung. Udo. Mess ring," said Dwyer quietly. Vangerich smiled. "Well informed." "There's little to do here, sir," said Dwyer. "I fill my time with the data slates and the court reports. I do like to keep up with the reported business of the legislature and the senatorum. Politics has always been an interest of mine. My old dad used to say that politics is what determines who lives and who dies, so though the business of Parliament sounds dull, it pays to keep an eye on what those idiots are up to. Publish senatorum records." "Don't show the half of it," said Vangerich. "They show enough to see that Langston's after Lord Commander and Udo's happy to facilitate that succession. Measuring and Ikath will go along for the ride and lend their weight if they get rewarded on the other side. Or is that read too simplistic? Am I just an armchair amateur?" "Good enough," said Vangerich. "It's the usual power play. But they're so busy playing they've taken their eyes off the board. The Fists have gone to address the situation, but they'll probably need support. Navy support. The Fists will need support?" "Why," I began. "Let's skip that for now. It's a threat. The Inquisition says so." Dwyer whistled. "How far out?" "Far too close. We need the Navy and we need the Guard, and if we need the Guard we need the Navy anyway, but Lansung doesn't want to get his toys broken. So make him look good." "I tried that," said Vangerich. "We broke it a little persuasive block vote to make him commit his fleets, but which allowed him to look like the hero of the hour. And he took it, which allowed him to look like the hero of the hour. And he took it. But he played us. He said that if the Fists needed full support, they should be allowed to commit their entire reserve. He made ships available. Even the War Brothers have gone from their eternal posts for the first time ever. The whole chapter. There isn't an Imperial Fist left on Terra or on the Phalanx. It's as if he's handing them glory, as if it's his to give. Of course, by making it possible for the entire chapter to deploy, he has reduced the commitment of fleet and guard forces he needs to field." "That's not right," said Dwyer. "You don't commit a whole chapter in one go, that's basic. You do if you're an idiot with dreams of a de facto throne. You do if you put yourself above the needs of mankind, and you do if you've become so complacent after decades of peace that you think nothing can ever harm us again. Beasts arise. Beasts arise. Wal laughed, though his face was troubled. They do, he agreed, when you least expect. First lesson they ever taught us. And the reason for your nickname, said Vangerich, that belonged to someone else, said Wire, losing the smile. I'm a respectable civil servant now. He looked at Vangerich. When did this happen? 6 weeks ago. It wasn't publicly announced a matter of security. The reinforcements should reach the main force very soon. That close? Oh, yes, Why shrugged. So may I ask, sir, he said, what was this visit? An opportunity to vent to a sympathetic ear? Or did you think that I could somehow offer a solution to help an entire chapter of a depth as a start is in trouble? Bang-Eric smiled. Back in the day, I would not have put such a task beyond the powers Beast Cruel. Beast Cruel's long gone, said Wire. Vangerich stood up. Anyway, no. Not at all, he said. I don't expect you to have a solution, and we don't need one. It's the entire chapter of Imperial Fists plus support, Beast. They will quash this threat very quickly, very quickly. Then no one will notice or remember how close we came to being stupid. He faced Wire. That's the real crisis. That's why I came to ask your opinion. It's not what's happening now. What's happening now is an act of strategic idiocy sanctioned by men who are too busy chasing the highest office. It's ugly and ham-fist, but it will resolve itself and all will be safe. We can trust the fists, but in the long term we are left with men who made it happen, let it happen, and thought it was absolutely fine that it happened. And that presents us with the possibility of what might happen next time, and the time after that, and the time after that, until such acts of idiocy really start to cost. These men are not fit beast. But they represent a seamless power block at the heart of the 12 that cannot be unshaken or dislodged, even with the most radical, tactical voting from the rest of us. The Senatorum Imperialis is theirs, and will remain theirs. Wire nodded, ruefully. I came, old friend, said Vangerich, because there is a possibility, with all other options exhausted, that one day soon I might have to ask you to go back to your old job. Glory, Wisford took a deep breath. I can't go back, sir. Not after all this time. I mean, that's not me anymore. I left the Ephysio. Draken Vangerich looked at him without pity or humor. Beasts arise is sad, he said, and besides, one never really leaves the Ephysio. Chapter 14. Ardermantua, Outer System approaches. The translation bells were sounding along the quarterdeck of the azimuth. Daylight rose to his feet from the arming block, took his helm off the rack, and lowered it over his head. The neck seals hissed and whirred into place. An attendant approached dressed in a yellow gown. I heard, said Daylight before the man could speak. The Imperial Fist methodically placed his boulder in its clamp, selected a gladius and sheathed it, and maglocked a combat knife to his chest plate. Then he finally adorned his head with a laurel wreath that marked him as the senior Imperial Fist in the reinforcement detachment. The laurel symbol had already been painted on his shoulder plates. He turned and walked from the arming chamber out onto the quarterdeck space. Hundreds of attendants in yellow robes stopped and watched him as he strode forwards. It was a moment, a singular moment. Daylight was going to war. Daylight was aware of the significance he had longed for war and felt guilty for doing so. Only the best were ever given the reward of warbrother status, but it amounted to a punishment because it took them from the zones of glory and made them live out their lives on ceremonial sentry duty in the drafty halls of the Palace of Terror. This had been his dream since he had won the status. Going back to war had been his dream. Yes, the significance was not lost on him. It was a day full of significance. It was the first time ever that war brethren had been allowed to leave Terror and the Phalanx and go to war in support of their kind. The first time ever that Wall Brethren had been allowed to leave Terror and the Phalanx and go to war in support of their kind. The first time that the entire chapter had been committed at one stroke since the days of the siege, when they had been a legion still. The first time since then that a capital threat had come inside 50 warp weeks of the Terran core. Though he was a creature bred for war, Daylight was not blind to the political significance either. Attending the palace, as he had done for so many years, he had watched the activities of a Senatorum and new power play and counter agendas when he saw them. Daylight's glorious return to war and the wielding of the Imperial Fists as one unified weapon at this time of crisis were merely byproducts of Lord High Admiral Lan Song's ascension. He had made himself look quite imperial by moving his forces in support of the Fists, and even more imperial by magnanimously suggesting that the Fists support and preserve their reputation. He had in effect facilitated everything that was happening. The fact that he had effectively sent an entire chapter of Adeptus Astartes to war left a great deal more unsaid about his power. Attendants swept up on either side of Daylight and attached a long cloak to his shoulders, a cloak of blue silk that trailed out behind him. Armed footmen fell in step around him, an honor guard supplied by hate. Just like politics, the cloak was an encumbrance that Daylight would dispense with in combat. They moved up the quarterdeck and under the Valvoir arches. The burnished deck throbbed beneath them as the warship bled out power. The warp had just spat out the azimuth after 6.5 weeks of travel, and now, translated into the realm of real space, they and the rest of the reinforcement squadron were slicing in across the outer banks and belts of the Ardermantua system into the compliance zone. As he walked, Daylight processed. Data feeds were inflowing to his visor mount and had been since the trip began. He processed the latest intercepts and battle reports from the line formation, archived data on the planet and the blister nest site, forced composition, and a rolling track of action by action detailed from the very first moment of deployment onwards. From the outside, Daylight looked like a ceremonial figure walking in a grand state parade. On the inside, he was a strategic him in war mode. Most of the data he could process was archived, however. It came from the early part of the compliance and from intercepts received before the reinforcement squadron had left the Terran core. They had spent weeks in the Empyrean and nothing viable or reliable had entered the data streams of astropathic communication links during the voyage. Now they were back in real space, the vast leap of their extra-universal transit achieved, communication could resume. Except, Daylight could see from the feeds, nothing was coming from the world, called Ardermantua. Nothing human. He entered the warship state bridge. Navy officers turned to acknowledge him with formal stiffness, but a gesture sent them back to their vast consoles, set in tiers up the mountainside flanks of the chamber. On high platforms with gilded handrails, strategy officers plotted courses and operated the vast hololithic displays of the Central Strategic. Lines of Navy armsmen in formal uniforms, and ranks 40 long and 7 wide, stood facing each other on the central, mirror-polished steel floor space of the bridge, forming an avenue down which Daylight could proceed to the commandius. They came to attention, their silver las carbines raised. Daylight walked the line, still processing. Nothing human. Nothing human. Admiral Kieran stepped off the dais to meet him, escorted by General Mascar and a small army of aides, sublieutenants, and autoclerks. Kieran was Lan Song's appointed proxy, a slender and unfriendly-looking man in late middle age with a permanently cunning expression on his face. He wore silver and blue and a broad bicorn hat. He carried the ship's command wand in his left hand. The wand was a jewel-encrusted device the size of a scepter or battle mace, and it hummed soft songs of deep space and the warpways to itself. Mascar was Lord Commander Militant Heath's proxy on the command warship, though Heath traveled with the squadron aboard the Grand Carrier Dubrovnik. Unlike Lancel, who had seen the Ardermantuan crisis in purely political terms and had instructed his officers to conduct it on his behalf, Heath was a more selfless individual. He appreciated the potential scale of the crisis and had elected to join the reinforcements in person. He led 68 brigades of the Astra Militarum, the biggest deployment from the course seen in years, and he was not about to place that in the hands of his juniors. Hate wanted to show that unlike Lan Sung and indeed the other High Lords, he was prepared to get his hands dirty. The Imperial Fists required the assistance of his Astra Militarum, and he intended to deliver that in person. He had caused a stir when Hate had announced his intention of joining the squadron. There was nothing Lan Sung could say about it that wouldn't look petty, but Lan Sung's thunder had been stolen a little. Hef was positioning himself as a willing man of the people, a leader who did, rather than told. It was clear that Hef saw this moment as an opportunity to show that the Astra Militarum, vast and reliable, was the most important service standing in the Imperium's defense, the truest and most doughty. It was also an opportunity for Heath to ease himself out of the shadow cast across the Senatorum High 12 by Lansong, Mesh Ring, and Udo. As per protocol, not all the squadron's senior officers traveled on the same vessel. Vox officers set up a real-time link to Hate so he could coordinate with them. Maskar was a useful officer, short and bullish, with an excellent track record. He had not long returned from service in a frontier campaign, the blood fresh on his tunic as the phrase went. Daylight had read Maskar's file. He liked the man, liked him for what he could do. None of that data was pertinent now, not Maskar's file, nor the politics on Terra. "Sir," said Kieran. "Anything?" asked Daylight. "Anything from the surface?" "No," replied the Admiral. "Nothing, human," Maskar added with a growl. "I have reviewed the incoming data," said Daylight. "It's very noisy, down there." Here I nodded to one of his analysis officers, who projected a small, hololithic display between his tech-engraved hands as though he was opening a book for them to look at. "Since our last data from Ardermantua," the analysis officer said, "the surface and atmospheric situations have degenerated catastrophically. The planet seems to have been plunged into some kind of stellar crisis. It's almost primordial down there. We presumed at first that it might have been struck by another body, a large meteor, but there is no trace of that very distinctive damage pattern." Daylight watched the man's shifting display, staying one step ahead of everything he said. "Ardermantua has been rendered unstable in the 6 weeks since we last saw it," the analysis officer continued. "It is unstable, atmospherically, geologically, and orbitally. There are gross levels of service radiation and significant signs of massive gravitic instability. There were never any indications of gravitic weaknesses in the early planetary surveys," said Admiral Kieran. "However," said Maskar, "some of the last few intercepts we received from the expedition force before we departed spoke of what appeared to be gravitational anomalies." "That data was never substantiated," said the analysis officer. "We have been attempted to contact Terra astropathically to see what they may have heard from the expedition fleet while we were in transit. The answer is precious little, it seems," said Kieran. He looked directly at the towering space marine. "Or effective contact with your chapter master and the expedition fleet was lost over 6 weeks ago, 2 days after we entered the warp." "So they are gone?" asked Daylight. "Dead. There is no sign of a fleet or of any surface deployment," said Maskar. "But that isn't to say they aren't there. The planet and its orbital environs are a mess of interference, patterns, and disruption," said the analysis officer. "It is quite possible that the fleet is there, as well as surface forces, but our scanners can't detect them, and we can't hear their vox." "So what are we hearing?" asked Daylight. "Massive amounts of sonic and infrasonic noise bursts," said the analysis officer. "Similar to the kind of noise bursts reported by the surface forces before comms went down, but of greater intensity, duration, and regularity. It's as though the planet is howling in agony." Kieran shot the man a scolding look. The analysis officer stepped back, ashamed of his colorful description. "What's making the noise?" asked Daylight. "I think it's some kind of stellar effect," said Kieran. "A solar storm, perhaps, or a transmitted byproduct of the gravitational mayhem." "Except," said Maskar. "Except?" asked Daylight. "It reads as organic," said Lord Commander Militant Hate's proxy. He said it hesitantly as though he didn't quite believe it himself. "How can it be organic?" asked Daylight. "A voice," murmured the analysis officer. "It's like a voice. It's something amplified and broadcast," said Maska. A weapon of some description, suggested Kieran. What action do we take? Asked Masker. We deploy, of course, said the unmistakable tones of the Lord Commander Militant. They turned. The Vox and Pickling could be established to the Lord Commander Militant's vessel, and his face, slightly crackled by interference patterns, had appeared in the ready field of a large, hololithic projector unit. Is that not rash, my lord? Asked Admiral Kieran. We don't even know how close we can get and maintain the safety of the squadron. We traveled 6 weeks to face a problem and perhaps save the lives of some honored friends, said Haight, his voice signal distorting slightly. We are also investigating a potential capital threat to the Terran core. I don't think this is the time to be prissy. How long until we're inside a decent deployment distance, Admiral? 4 hours and 17 minutes, replied Kieran. Are the men ready for planetary landing, General? Hath asked. Or infantry and armor support will be boarded on the dropships and surface landers within the hour, sir, replied Maskar. I can commit a full force drop as soon as we're in range. And the Imperial Fists? Asked Haight, the War Brethren. We are ready, replied Daylight. Then the only thing that appears rash, said Haight, is the notion of me making this decision rather than waiting to hear it from a nominated and honored commander of this expedition. Forgive me, sir. The call is yours. There was a pause. Thank you, my lord, said Daylight. Even the extremity of the conditions, I believe it would be prudent to arrange an advance recon, fast and powerful, to penetrate the zone and report back before we risk the bulk of our forces. I will lead this. Have a ship prepared. Daylight looked at Heath. The main force should be held at readiness. As soon as we have data, and as soon as an enemy or objective is identified, the fleet elements and the Imperial Guard will take it with the fury of the Emperor himself. Does that seem like a plan to you, my lord? I couldn't have put it better myself, replied Haight. Then let us begin, said Daylight. The Emperor protects, not in Mascara and Kieran, making the sign of the Aquila. Emperor protects, not Ed Mosgar and Kieran making the sign of the Aquila. And we in turn, replied Daylight, protect him. Chapter 15. Ardermantua like stooping raptors, pinions swept back for the long dive, the stormbirds plunged into the swirling atmospheric halo surrounding stricken Ardermantua. The planet was swathed by a bright visible corona of agitated energy, a sensor-opaque aura that shrouded the orb to almost the depth of its own radius. It resembled a solar storm, a swirling luminous ocean of gas, dust, and radiation that flickered in blues, golds, ambers, and reds. The planet itself was just a dark globe silhouetted within the maelstrom. Just as the Wall brothers had been drawn out of traditional service and allowed to roam away from terror, so the Stormbird war machines, the fastest and most honored of all the dropcraft and the arsenal of the Adeptus Astartes, had been selected for the reinforcement mission. Stormbirds, sleek, powerful, and large capacity, had been born in the earliest years of the Great Crusade, developed from the almost mythical Skylance dropships that had served during the final days of the Unification Wars, splitting open the hives of Salonia and End. Stormbirds had been the interorbital weapon of choice throughout the Crusade, and through the dark, treacherous time that had been the unexpected sequel to that bright glory. The heresy had consumed them in great numbers, however, just as it had consumed men and brothers and legions, and the forces of the Imperium had been obliged to resort to more utilitarian vehicles that were cheaper and easier to mass produce. These replacement craft were now ubiquitous in all chapters and had proved worthy of service through their simple functionality and durability. Still, for those with long memories, there was nothing like a Stormbird to stir the heart. The symbol of the Emperor's wrath, wings hooked back like an Aquila, one only saw them in ceremonial flypasts these days, or in the Hall of Weapons, or as escorts for High Lords, War Masters, and Sector Governors. Daylight had ordered 6 of them to be raised from the Fists chapter house hangars and stowed aboard the reinforcement fleet. No one had argued. Heath's presence on the campaign mission had helped. He was a High Lord, after all. Firing from the capital ships like missiles, the Stormbirds formed a formation spread and screen dived into the unholy vortex surrounding the planet. Ardermantua lay beneath them, a vast curve of gray, mottled with orange, and crackled with veins of fire. Cloud banks and storm patterns of vast magnitude curdled and swirled across the boiling surface. Magnetics, radiation, and the pop of gravity blisters rendered the near-space realm a lethal soup. "We have substantial volcanism around the equatorial belt," reported the lead Stormbird's tech adept. "The crust there is forting and splitting." The Stormbird was shaking. Daylight keyed up the data on his overhead monitor and swung it down on its gimbal arm. On the flickering pict, strung with overlays, the planet seemed to have a burning white-hot girdle around its waist. "Something's happening to the magnetic poles," said the adept. "The planet is deforming." His voice cut out briefly as another noise burst ripped through the vox links, squalling and deafening. The screech was painful, but Daylight's ears could endure it. He had a concern for the human component of his task force, however. The unmodified, unaugmented humans of the Imperial Guard formed the greatest proportion of its strike force. They would suffer either through mortal injury from unmoist bursts or through lack of coordination if Voxcom proved unviable. What were the implications if he was unable to deploy any of his guard strength to the surface? Could the Wall brothers complete the mission unassisted? Could they find and rescue the Shield Corps? Rescue was a word he certainly did not like. The Stormbirds began to shake more furiously as they entered the outer radiation bands of a high atmosphere. Plumes of what looked like flame flashed past the small semi-shuttered cabin ports. The tongues were blue, mauve, and green, like noxious gases burning in a lab. For a moment, Daylight wondered if they were some trace of the warp, some demonic lightning. All along there had been quiet rumors that the Silent Hand of Chaos, whose actions had been absent from the galactic theater for a troublingly long time, might be playing a part in the Ardermantuan misadventure. But it was not false fire or warp scald, it was a geomagnetic display, a raw as of charged particles ripping through the Manton thermosphere. "Any indication of vessels in near space?" asked Daylight. "Negative," replied the tech adept. Another hope dashed. There was a fleet here somewhere, the best part of the entire Imperial Fists battle fleet, unless it had been utterly reduced and annihilated already. Where was it? It could be directly in front of them, but veiled from them by the tumult. The descent turbulence became progressively worse. The Stormbird was shaking like a sistrum at a fervent ritual. Lines of red alert lights were flashing into life along the pilot's enclosing consoles, filling entire rows. Deathly, with great calm, the pilot took one black leather-gloved hand off the helm and muted the alarms. Daylight began to flick through the meager and imperfect surface scan readings they were finally obtaining as they got closer and their all-spec systems penetrated the atmosphere a little more deeply. They were on a pre-selected dive towards the location of a blister nest, working on the tactical assumption that the site was the last place their forces had been reported. But there was no clear sign of the structure, and little of the surrounding landmass matched, in relief or topographical schematiform at least, the geography logged by the survey teams that had accompanied the original assault. "Is this just bad luck?" asked Zarathustra. Daylight turned and looked at the Wall brothers strapped in beside him. Zarathustra's wall spear was mounted like a harpoon on the weapon rack above his grim-helmed head. He was the oldest of all the Wall brothers and had been the most reluctant to abandon the old tradition and leave the walls of all the War brothers, and had been the most reluctant to abandon the old tradition and leave the walls of the palace behind. "Bad luck," replied Daylight. He noted that Zarathustra had selected the discretion of a helm-to-helm link. There were other War brothers in the craft alongside them. Not to mention 40 atmospherically armored shock troops of the Astra Militarum Asmodeite's 70th, Hate's finest. The guardsmen and their leader, Major Nyman, seemed to Daylight to be about the finest and most resolute warriors that unmodified human flesh could compose. But he did not want them overhearing dissent from an Adeptus to start his warrior as they fell headlong into Hades. Through the dark and slightly breath-fogged visor lenses of their faceplates he could see pale, drawn, anxious faces that winced at every vibrant buck and lurched the Stormbird through. "Bad luck happens, even to good men, Daylight," said Zarathustra, his voice chopped and frayed by the interference patterns even on the short-range dedicated link. Sometimes the forces of light prevail, sometimes the forces of darkness take the upper hand, sometimes, as history teaches us, fate itself intervenes. He turned his impassive visor to look directly at daylight. There was a gouge of raw metal across the otherwise perfectly polished faceplate, a gouge that had been left by the blade of one of the sons of Horus during the fight at Zarathustra Wall. Hero's wounds were never patched, though the brother who had taken that stroke no longer dwelt inside the armor. "Think of cold blood and his wall at Orphan Mons," said Zarathustra. "They took that day against the Eldar raiders full of glory. Then the star went over and took cold blood, his wall, and the surviving elder. Victor and defeated alike, leveled by the whim of a consciousnessless cosmos. They say they held our courses, engineers that stir a bomb to effect a Pyrrhic victory," said Daylight. They say, don't spoil my story," grumbles Zarathustra. "My point is sound. Sometimes you kill the enemy, sometimes the enemy kills you, and sometimes the universe kills you both. This may have been a very conventional fight against these zero forms, these chrome things. Myron was probably wiping the floor with them, soaking the dust with their blood, or whatever they have that passes from blood." Zarathustra's eye slits were milky pale and backlit by a faint green glow. The Daylight could feel the intensity of his old friend's gaze upon him. "Then the planet dies. Solar storm, gravity anomaly, tachyon event, whatever. Doesn't matter who's winning then, we end up with a mess, like this." Daylight glanced at his overhead again. The only time he had ever seen data footage of a planet as catastrophically mangled and tortured as Ardermantua was in feeds of unstable worlds to be avoided as not supportive. 6 weeks earlier, the cream of his chapter, the majority of his kin, the Shield Co itself, had been down there, dug in, and on a solid footing, burning out the last vestiges of a numerous but outclassed enemy. "Are you suggesting we turn back and give them others lost?" he asked. "Of course not." "Then what?" "I'm suggesting that we prepare ourselves for the worst," said Zarathustra. "If this mud ball has up and died under Master, Myron and our brothers, then we will make a great mourning like never before, greater even than we did for our Primarch progenitor," said Daylight simply. "It would be the worst loss imaginable," agreed Zarathustra, "for the Imperial Fists, the old seventh, greatest to all the Adeptus Astartes, and the most loyal of all defenders of Terror to be reduced to nothing but the last 50 warbrothers stationed at the palace, to lose all but 5% to be diminished to a 20th. How would we ever recover from that?" Daylight had no answer. Zarathustra was right. It was unthinkable. Even a force of transhuman warriors dedicated to dying in the service of the Imperium did not like to consider what might happen if they all died. The gene seed loss alone would be an atrocity. Could they ever rebuild, even turning to successor chapters for support and bloodline? No loyal first founding chapter had ever been entirely swept away, not in the history of the Imperium, not even in the Heresy War. Would the Imperial Fists be the first to pass into legend? Some said, quietly and very informally, that it was inevitable. The Adeptest of parties were a dying breed. Bloodlines and gene seeds were gradually failing over time. The vigor had waned, and long gone was the time, pre-heresy, when thousands upon thousands of space marines marshaled under the stars. The bitter gall of the heresy had cut them down, half their legions decimated the surviving loyalists, and tragically reduced the chapter's ability to produce new space marines and anything like the numbers of old. With a possible exception of the Ultramorians, and even there was the contention that the same plight ultimately afflicted them too, the Adeptus Astartes were diminishing. They were a finite resource, used only for the most elite missions and efforts. They were, slowly, very slowly, dying out. Senior men in the chapter predicted that within 400 or 500 years and less effective new methods of gene seed synthesis could develop, and a new golden age brought about for Space Marine would be a thing of myth. In his early life, before the honor of Warbrother had been granted him, before he had become Daylight, Daylight had fought the Elder. In fact, it was his deeds in the face of the Elder that had led to the Warbrother honor being bestowed upon him. Daylight had admired the Elder immensely. They were truly worthy opponents, and he had always thought them sad, tragic, like figures in an ancient play. He had thought about them often as he paced the ritual patrol routes in the cold hallways of Daylight Wall. They were great warriors, the greatest their species could produce, and in their time, in older ages, they had been peerless among the infinite stars. Their time had passed, however, and their glory with it. Their suns were setting, and they were but ghosts of their old selves, unimpeachable warriors with great stories, proud histories, old glories, and fine hearts, who were simply fighting their end-day wars as they waited for extinction to overwhelm them. When Daylight had slain the crest-held master of Sir Foy One Craft World, there had been tears in the alien's eyes, and tears in Daylight's too. When great eras end, all should mark them, even the champions of the next epoch, and no great heroes should ever pass into shadow, unmourned. For a long time, Daylight had felt that the Space Marines were facing a similar, long decline. They were more like the worthy Eldar than they cared to admit, giants from another age who were simply living out their twilight amongst mortals, incapable of fending off the gathering darkness and unable to recapture their halcyon greatness. Daylight had not expected to see that end approach so fast inside his own lifespan. If the Imperial Fists were as lost as Zarathustra feared, perhaps the age of the Adeptus Astartes was coming to a close faster than anyone imagined. Zarathustra's words had troubled him in another way. He had spoken of a terrain turning against friend and foe alike, of Ardermantua and its geological mayhem being the true enemy. That was a bleak prospect. The pride of the Imperial Fists was their ability to defend anywhere from anything. How could they hope to excel if anywhere and everywhere the very ground itself turned on them? The Stormbird bucked again, more violently than ever, more warning lights lit, and a klaxon sounded. The pilot and his co-pilot were too busy controlling the breakneck descent to be able to cancel at this time. The lurching turned into a protracted bout of shuddering vibrations. ATM. Varric's worse than conjectator prediction, said the tech adept, a flutter in his voice. Crosswinds, also, ash in the upper air bands. Ash, volcanic ash, also particulate matter, aerosolized mud, organic residue. Hold on, the pilot yelled suddenly. The Stormbird started a bank along its center line. The exterior light beaming into the gloom of the cabin through the slit ports began to rapidly creep up the cabin walls over the ceiling and back down the other side, illuminating the struggling, desperate faces of the Asmodai troopers behind their visor plates, cheeks and chins tugged by the inverting gravity. The banking turned into a full rotation, then another, and then another, faster. Daylight knew that the humans aboard weren't built to withstand that kind of flight trauma. The Stormbird crew members were modified enough to withstand it, with their reinforced bones and muscle sheaths, their inner ears and proprioception senses replaced by augmetics, and their stomachs and regurgitative mechanisms removed and regrafted with fluid ingestors. But the Imperial Guardsmen would be disorientated, panicked, distressed, vomiting inside their helmets, choking. Stabilize, Daylight ordered. Negative, negative, the pilot yelled back. We've hit some kind of gravitational. He didn't finish the word. The turbulence became too great and too noisy for voice contact. The unpredictable gravitational anomalies that plagued Ardermantua were regarded as the greatest threat of all, because they couldn't be mapped and thus avoided, and they couldn't be explained. Daylight heard the pilot yell something again. On the ground, a broad plain of mud and boiling pools lay beneath the angry sky. Ragged grasses blew in the hot crosswinds. In the distance, the broken horizon coughed and smoked and spat sparks into the sky. The sky was low, a rotting mass of swirling clouds striped by lightning. The clouds were running swiftly across it like a picked feed playing fast. Far away, 6 bright raptors punched out of the clouds, diving, catching the sun. They stayed in formation for a second, but they were fluttering, beset by both savage crosswinds and a gravitational pocket that refused to obey the reality around it. One burst into flames like a flower blooming, scattering its shredded fuselage. A second failed to recover from its dive and plunged like a stone into the distant hills. A third tried to bank but then spun away like a leaf on the wind, out of sight. The other 3 stayed true, pulled up, cut low, but their trajectories were not stable either. Gravity stammered again, bubbling the sky and slamming them hard. They fell into darkness and black cloud, and were lost. Chapter 16. Ardermantua. Antarius 6 was dead. They carried him from the crash site and laid him next to the 9 Asmodai fatalities. Daylight waited for Nyman to tell him the extent of the other injuries. Zarathustra clambered back into the wreck to recover his spear. Daylight knew he was also going to mercifully finish off the valiant pilot and co-pilot who had brought them down as intact as they were, and now lay mashed and bleeding out in the Stormbird's compressed nose cone. They were plugged into the dropcraft systems anyway, nerves and neural links. They had burned their minds out, sharing the Stormbird's impact agonies. Even without their limbs and torsos irrecoverably sandwiched in ruptured metal, they could never have been disconnected to walk away. It was a duty Daylight would have preferred to do, but he had command, and there were too many duties to deal with. He appreciated Zarathustra taking that sad burden from him. He looked down at Antarius 6's body. On impact, a fracturing spar had sheared the Warbrother's head off. "I never thought I'd see him dead," said Tranquility, a Daylight sighed. The plain they had come down on was a broad one surrounded by low-smoked arc hills. It was grassy and peppered with curiously pretty blue flowers. Some of the petals, torn up by the crash and scattered by the wind, had fallen across Antarius 6's yellow armor as if laid there by mourners. "No time for sentiment," said Daylight. "Give me a situation report, brother." Tranquility cleared his throat. "Flight crew dead, Daylight," he said. "Transport destroyed, box link down. No bearing from our instrumentation and portable auspices flatlined. Last known location was 40 kilometers short of the Blister Nest site." Daylight nodded. "No contact with the other birds," said Tranquility. "I saw one blow out." "I think at least one crashed before we hit," Tranquility agreed. "Gravity was just shot. We probably all fell out of the sky. So we're all that we can count on," said Daylight. "There might be others nearby who survived the landing, and—" Tranquility began. "This is not a place where we can deal in mites," replied Daylight. "Even the laws of the universe are playing tricks. We can only count on what we know." "I understand," replied Tranquility. "Then we have you, and we have me. We have Zarathustra, and we have Bastion Ledge. We have decent resources of ammunition and our close combat weapons. We have no ground transport. We have Major Nyman, a brain-damaged tech adept, and 26 Imperial Guardsmen with kit. I thought there were 9 fatalities among me as a Mardai. There were outright, but there are 5 more of them, 2 torn up to walk away. Out here they'll all be dead in an hour, less perhaps. Even with expressive actuation to a Medicaid frigate, they probably wouldn't make it. We move out," said Daylight. "Find high vantage, assess the landscape, and consider our next action." Tranquility nodded. Daylight strode back through the flowering grasses towards the Stormbird wreck. Zarathustra was just emerging spear in hand. He reminded Daylight of one of the ancient pre-Unity demigods born alive from the belly of a fallen eagle. He liked the old myths. Paintings and tapestries of them filled the galleries and halls of the Imperial Palace, their meanings, names, and symbolism lost forever, except perhaps in the memories and dreams of the Emperor. "Bad?" asked Zarathustra. "And getting worse," Daylight replied. "We're heading for those hills. You and I will move ahead with Bastion. Tranquility can escort the guardsmen. We should stay together. They'll slow us down. They'll never cover the ground like we can. Besides, they're in shock. What if they're wounded? They'll make them even slower." "I know. I'll do it." They walked back to the gathered survivors. A few of the Asmodai were carrying munitions and equipment crates from the open stowage cavities of the Stormbird. Others crouched beside their injured brethren. Daylight noted that a few had formed a perimeter, lost weapons ready, not in such shock then. They remembered their duty. The sun came out suddenly, covering the ragged plain and its sea of straw-colored grasses and nodding flowers in a hot golden light. The roiling black clouds had parted briefly. The Stormbird had torn a 2-kilometer scar across the ground, a long gouge, like the one that the Harusian blade had left on Zarathustra's faceplate. The Stormbird's impact had ripped up grasses and soil and bedrock and scattered silvered shreds of its bodywork, wings, and undercarriage. The fragments of metal caught the sudden sunlight like pieces of mirror or broken glass scattered in the swishing grasses, or like the cut jewels of a broad cloak spread out behind the noble craft. "We're moving for those hills," Daylight told Major Nyman. "I've activated a beacon, sir," said Nyman. His voice was a really croak, issuing through the speaker grill of his orbital armor. Through the tint of the man's visor, Daylight could see an abrasion head wound that was starting to clot. "Good. At least any who follow can trace our landing point." "Will any follow?" asked Nyman. Daylight was turning away, but he stopped to look back down at the human soldier. "I told them not to, but Lord Commander Militanthith will send others," he said. "He will not give up. I would not in his place." Nyman followed Daylight over to the Asmati casualties. "Some of us will scout ahead," Daylight told him, "but even allowing for your rate of advance, we cannot be encumbered. You know what I have to do." Nyman's mouth opened in horror, but he had no words. "They will all be dead in an hour. Less, perhaps," but in tranquility, repeating the summation he'd made to Daylight. Even with expressive actuation to a Medicaid frigate, they probably wouldn't make it. There was a moment's pause. The sunlight blazed. Radiation made their built-in meters crackle like crickets at dusk. Thunder, wind, and volcanics rumbled in the distance and made the ground fidget. "Is there going to be an issue here?" Daylight asked Major Nyman. "No. Issue, sir," Nyman replied with great effort. He turned his back and signaled his men to do the same. In slow realization and horror, they stepped back and looked towards the bleak edges of a horizon bowl. One hesitated, a hand on the grip of his sidearm. Bastion looked at him, and that was enough. Zarathustra came to stand with Nyman and his men, and gazed at the distant hills and the sky filled with smoke. He began to declare the litany of the fallen, as it was said in chapels and templums and sacristies across the loving Imperium, the words set down by Malkader himself during the bloodiest months of the heresy. His voice was clear and strong and carried from the speaker of his battle helm. Bastion and Tranquility joined him in his declaration, a mark of honor to the fallen guard and the sacrifice of the Asmodai. Nyman made the sign of the Aquila. The three war brothers boosted the amplification of their speakers as they intoned the litany, partly to add power to their statement of respect, and partly to mask the sound of bones snapping. Daylight drew a breath, and then quickly and gently broke 5 human necks in quick succession. Chapter 17. Chapter 17. Ardermantua, the sunlight seemed to be at odds with them. It followed them across the grassy plain away from the crash site. From underfoot came the thump and shake of a planet in convulsion, and great sprays of burning ash lit up the sky far away, volcanic plumes thousands of kilometers wide. The sunlight followed them still as if their world were a tranquil place. Daylight, Zarathustra, and Bastion moved ahead, covering the grasses with clean, strong bounding strides outpacing the sturdy efforts of Naaman's fighting pack. Daylight wondered if you were to have finished the Tech Adept too. The man had been Cortex plugged to the Stormbird's cogitator system when they crashed. He had suffered neural feedback, and the impact had torn his plug out and mangled the primary socket in the back of his neck. He was stumbling along at the back of the secondary group, escorted by one of the guardsmen. Daylight thought he would give him an hour or so to see if his head cleared and reset. If it did, the adept might usefully operate some of their portable equipment. If it didn't, Daylight would revise his decision. Plumes of ash smoke and white streamers of steam were borne across the plain on the wind, residue of distant cataclysms. They left the crash site far behind, the wreck and the Hirsiskar of its death across a foreign field, and moved towards the nearest hills. Noise bursts continued to beset them, coming from both near at hand and far away, as if wilderness spirits, the genius loci of Ardermantua, were howling at them and taunting them for their efforts. Daylight wished the tech adept could set up and examine the audio patterns, but the man was incapable. The noise bursts, some of them long and tortured, were overwhelming their limited-range Vox 2 and causing discomfort to the Asmodai. Daylight instructed Nyman and his men to switch off their suit comms. Thus, the only communication between the two moving groups was the Vox link between Daylight's party and Tranquility, who was escorting the guard. It was not ideal. Daylight also possessed enough imagination to know that it was not ideal for the individual guardsmen either. Each one of them was alone in his stifling and cumbersome orbital drop suit, the armor heavy and rubbing, with fear and disorientation in his heart and trauma and grief in his bones. They were trudging along in the strange and sickly sunlight, hearing the distant roar of the noise bursts as contact vibrations transmitted by the atmospheric armor helms with no voices and no Vox chatter, only the inexorable sound of their own breathing inside their suits for company. The three Space Marines, advancing away from the beleaguered troopers, were approaching the foothill slopes of the ragged outcrops that edged the plain. Now the sun was going in and out as clouds gathered and spilled across the sky. Something had detonated on the horizon, and the sky was filling up with blackness, the smoke trying to erase every corner of light. Zarathustra led the way, using the half of his war spear as a climbing staff, leaping up slumped boulders and ridges of displaced stone. Bastion and Daylight followed, almost amused by the old veteran's vitality. They reached the peak. Beyond them, 1,000 kilometers away, the next ridge of mountains was on fire, a ring of active volcanoes. Darkness seemed to have gathered above the next drift valley like a threat. Jagged and almost magical explosions rippled across the valley floor, a spontaneous and random gravitational anomalies like the one that had downed the Stormbirds chewed up the ground and blew subcrust magma into the air. Impact patterns of disruption on a seismic level traveled through the ground away from the explosions. At this sight, Daylight's mind turned to other images stored in the books and paintings of the Imperial Palace, visions of the apocalypse, of the circles of the Inferno described by Dante, of the imagined hell once thought to exist beneath the earth. The Rift Valley was a vast plain of smoldering rubble that shifted and flexed, exploded, and shivered. Mountains had both been raised and had fallen overnight. Valleys had uplifted into hills, fracturing the surface, and summits had plunged like avalanches into the bowels of the ground. Flames leapt up from the mangled earth and burning geysers like signs or portents. Flammable, noxious gases released from deep in the planet were burning with strange colors, purple, blue, green, yellow, as varied as the magnetic auroras that had wreathed their wings on their descent. In places the flames were black and a mile high. "Has the arch-enemy touched this place?" asked Bastion Leg cautiously. "Is that warp craft?" "No," said Daylight. "This is just a planet dying. Strange phenomena manifest when a planet dies. 4 or 5 kilometers from them, beyond the initial spill of rubble and rocks, there was a broad lake, silty and muddy, its surface stirred and chopped by wind and vibration." Daylight selected data from his helm memory and began to patch and repatch quick overlays. "That's the river," he said. "The river?" asked Bastion Leg. The blister nest was sited beside a large river. "The geography has been dramatically altered, but that is the river, I'm sure of it. There are just enough compatibles to make the connection. The river has broken its bank and overspilled and then been dammed into the lake formation by the collapsing outcrops here and here. The blister nest will be partly submerged, and I think partly covered by geological debris. But it should be in this position." He marked the proposed site on his optics, and then copy-bursted the overlay to the visor displays of his two warbrothers. "An objective, then?" asked Bastion Leg. "The blister nest was the last reported location of our Shield Corps ground forces," said Daylight. "Ardermantua was the last reported location," growled Zarathustra. "I don't think we can say anything more specific than that." "We'll head for it anyway," said Daylight. "It's a place to start." He clambered back across the ragged top of the peak to Vox Link to Tranquility and informed the secondary group what the new intention was. Below he saw the flash of Laz weapons discharging. In the sunlit grassland, under an alien storm of ash, Tranquility and Naaman's Asmodai guardsmen were under attack. Chapter 18. Ardermantua. It was a chrome. Major Nyman knew this because he thoroughly reviewed the briefing packet that had been circulated among the officers of the Reinforcement Task Force, and the packet had included helm-picked captures of the chromes in action. It came at him through the grass, claws raised, and mouthpart snapping, making a most peculiar noise that he could only hear in the claustrophobic isolation of his atmospheric armor. He shouted an order that he instantly realized no one except him could actually hear, brought his last pistol up, and shot 2 bolts of the charging Xenos. It slowed it down, but didn't kill it. Nyman had to snap off 4 more shots before it dropped a few meters short of where he was standing. He looked around, having to turn his whole body to maximize the view through his narrow visor port. He could hear his own rapid respiration as if he was in a box. He could smell the rancid bitterness of his sweat and breath laced with adrenaline. Muffled noises came to him as though through water, the dull bangs of weapons, shouts, sunlight shone into his visor, glare. There were crumbs all around them, most of them the glossy silver xenotype. He wasn't sure where they had come from, but the odds were they were burrowers and had come up through the soil, clawing their way out. His men, without orders to give them structure, had nevertheless obeyed essential combat drill and were forming a box, firing out at the things rushing them from all sides. The Asmodai were fine soldiers, trained by the very best in the gun schools of the old Pan-Pacific. Their proud boast to be the best in the Astromilitarum was not without merit. Lost rifles flashed and snapped in disciplined volleys, the searing lashbolts ripping open organic armor and mutilating limbs, puffs and squirts of ichor drizzled into the bright air. One of the crones, a very large, dark, variant form, survived the rifle fire barrage and made it to their line. It got Corporal Vladen in its claws and tore him in half the way a man would rip a sheet of paper when he was done reading the message written on it. Ribbons of bright red blood shivered into the air and covered the grass. Bladen's armored suborbital dropsuit split, like overheated plastic wrapping. Tranquility, the massive Imperial Fist, waded in and drove a dark creature back, striking it twice with his power hammer. Leaking fluids, through crushed splits in its shell, the chrome reared back and launched itself with the Space Marine. There was no time or space for a defensive swing. Tranquility met the heavily built animal and grappled with it, gripping its chattering mouthparts with his left hand and tearing while he tried to stave off its claws. As they broke again, Tranquility came away with part of a mandible in his hand. Ichor spurted down the chrome's throat and chest. Tranquility knocked it down with a hammer blow and then swung his power hammer down in both hands and finished it with a devastating overhead strike. More chromes tore up out of the ground, flinging soil and uprooted grasses in all directions. Some of them were big and dark like the thing that had murdered Vladen. The Asmodai redoubled their fire rate, snapping off shots to keep the creatures at maximum distance. Neiman kept shooting, directing fire by means of gestures. There was no way of knowing how many more of the things lay under the ground. Tranquility closed with another of the things lay under the ground. Tranquility closed with another of the more massive forms, dispatched it with 2 clean blows of his hammer, and then found himself beset by 2 more of the dark beasts. They clawed at him, fending off his attempts to swing at them. With a curse, he drew his bolt gun and shot each one point blank, exploding their carcasses in shards of meat, gristle, and body fluid. He'd cut them a path. Neiman could see that, and he could plainly see the Space Marines' emphatic gestures. They had a path towards the hill slopes. In the distance, he could see the other Imperial Fists, War Brothers, bounding down the hill to join them. The hill slopes offered the protection of boulders and rocks for cover and a small hope of staying alive until the other Space Marines reached them. Neiman knew his men would have to double time and shoot as they ran. He sent the signal, and most of them started to move, but visibility in the suits was so poor that some missed the gesture and found themselves caught out. Alone. Neiman ran to them, grabbing them so he could look in through their visor plates and press his head against theirs, yelling so that the touching helms would transmit the sound. "Get moving! The hills! Move it, man!" They started running. Neiman and Trooper Furnace scud the poor tech adapt along. The damaged man had little clue what was going on. Trooper Galvit had been slow to recognize the intended effort, and once he did, ran the wrong way. Nyman, dismayed, believed that Galvit had suffered some concussion during the crash and was not thinking clearly. His fuzziness cost him his life. 2 silver-shelled chromes ran him down and fell upon him, shredding him with their claws. Nyman didn't watch. He ran, dragging the tech adept by the arm with one hand, firing at the chromes that menaced them with his weapon in the other. As soon as the Asmodai were moving towards the hill slopes, Tranquility fell in behind them, his back to them, retreating and fending off the chromoms that gave chase. He whirled his hammer and struck them down as they came at him, knocking them over onto their backs, splitting their shells, breaking their limbs and their spines. His power hammer was a long-hafted, weaponized version of a stonemason's mallet, the sort of tool that had been used to raise the bulwark walls and defenses of a palace of terror. Its design was symbolic, its effect was not. Naaman, still moving with Trooper Furnace and their befuddled charge, was suddenly aware of yellow shapes racing past them from the direction of the slope. Daylight, Bastion legend Zarathustra, had joined the fight. Daylight had his gladius raised. Zarathustra was lifting his war spear. Bastion Ledge hefted a power mace. They reached the line where Tranquility was single-handedly stopping the chromes and crashed into the mass of them, rending and slicing, smashing and tearing. Nyman reached the lowest of the heaped boulders at the foot of the slope and pushed the tech adept into cover with a gesture to Furnace to look after him. His men were taking up positions among the tufted rocks and outcrops, slithering up the scree and loose pebbles and sighting their rifles as they found good firing places. They looked back at the fight. Several hundred chromes, most of them silver-shelled, had broken out of the soil of the plain and were assaulting the line. Dozens of them already lay dead, generally split or sliced open. Steam from hot fluids clouded the cool air of the grassy plain. Overhead, a looming volcanic darkness threatened to close down the light. The 4 Imperial Fists, War Brothers, Battlekin, Shield Corps, fought side by side. It was diligent work, dutiful work, holding ground so that the guardsmen could find cover and in turn support them with directed fire. It was a blocking action, it was a defensive stance, it was holding ground, it was everything that the Imperial Fists did best. Daylight knew that none of the 4 of them, would or could ever admit that joy was filling them at that moment. Despite the crisis, the predicament, the threat, and the possibility that their chapter was lost and dead, they secretly felt joy. Their greatest and darkest prayer to the God Emperor of mankind and to the Primarch progenitor who sired them had been answered. After years of silence ritually patrolling the walls of the Imperial Palace, they had been granted the right to fight again, perhaps for one last time. War, for which they had been wrought, had finally admitted them back into its secret dark and savage mystery. They were whole again. They would make the most of it. Nyman and his men watched in awe as the 4 Wall Brothers fought back the tide. Imperial Fists, chosen as War Brothers, were the greatest of their kind and had excelled at feats of arms. It was for their very excellence that they were selected as the embodiment of a chapter's creed and set to stand guard on the walls where they had mounted their greatest defense and paid in blood. He could see why these men had been chosen. He could also see how many more chromes, hulking and dark-bodied, were splitting the side of the plain and clawing their way into the sunlight. Chapter 19. Ardermantua. Orbital. Any sign from a surface? Asked Admiral Karen. The Vox officer shook his head. Karen slowly crossed the bridge of the azimuth to meet Maskar and Lord Commander Militant Hate. Hate had joined them from his warship as the reinforcement fleet decelerated to the drop point. "We've lost them then," said Maskar. "She am madness going down into that murk and mayhem blind." Hate looked at him. "I suggest you get your men ready, Maskar, because you'll be following soon enough. We're not going to leave the Imperial Fists to rot down there." "And what makes you suspect they are anything except dead already, sir?" asked Maskar. "With respect, look at the screens. Look at the data flow. This is a fool, Zerend. Nothing has survived the fate that has before in our dementia. Not even their damned fleet survived. We give them another 5 hours, said Hate. That's my word on it. 5 hours? Then we send in more scouts. The first thing Daylight will do is set up a workable uplink or send some kind of signal. Mascar looked at Kieran. There was no love lost between the Navy man and the Guard commander, but they were thinking the same thing. Hate, a High Lord, was painfully out of touch. He clearly thought the Adapterus Astartes immortal. There were certain situations, certain conditions, certain environments that nothing could survive. They were both working men, fighting men, and they had seen how bad it could actually get, not how bad it could be imagined from a throne in a palace. Move the picket ships in closer, Admiral Kieran told his deck officers. Have them dispatch more long-range probes. Probes will be obliterated, just like the last spread, said Mascar. Some may survive, replied Kieran curtly. Even if one of them survives to send back a millisecond of data, it will help. Besides, with the picket ships closer to the atmospheric rim, we can try penetrating deeper with auspex and primary sensors. Hate nodded. The deck officers hurried to their stations and began to relay instructions. They watched the strategium display as the reinforcement fleet began to move into its new spread, circling the stricken planet. Indicator lights and icons drifted like sunlight dapples across the topographic grid. In the lower portion of the strategium's vast, tololithic array, columns of data spread, jumbled and reassembled, processing the energetic flux and signature of a planet. Kieran had never seen a planetary body generate so much wild and contradictory data so rapidly. Wait, he said suddenly. He crossed to one of the observation consoles and shoved 2 sensor adepts out of his way. He began to manipulate the controls himself. What are you doing? Asked Hate. Kieran didn't reply immediately. Most of the crew in a huge bridge space were watching him. Kieran irritably yanked off most of the crew in the huge bridge space were watching him. Kieran irritably yanked off his gloves so he could better manipulate the control surfaces. His fingers wound back the brass dials and adjusted the ivory sliders until he had recaptured the data stream information from a few moments before. There, he said, I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking at, Mascar ventured. Admiral, please elucidate, said Hate. I know what I'm seeing, said Kieran, and I'm sure my senior officers do too. In truth, many of them hadn't immediately recognized it. Few had Kieran's years of experience, and few had seen as much cosmological data speed by them as the Admiral had, but given a few seconds with a data stream artificially suspended and frozen, they could pick it up. A ghost, said the primary or spec supervisor. A ghost, agreed Kieran with a grin. It could just be an imaging artifact, said the gunnery officer. Or the echo of a piece of debris blown out by the surface disruption, suggested the oldest of the navigation adepts, running the same data through his own handheld quantifier. I don't believe it is, said Kieran. I think that's a ghost. The ghost of a friend. Hate and Mascar moved closer to the vast display, trying to work out what everyone seemed to be seeing. This blip, asked the Lord Commander Militant, this shadow here, against the relative lower hemisphere of the planet. Yes, my lord, said Kieran. Censores, have the advancing picket ships direct their full gain all specs and detect the grids of that shadow, and the fleet too for what it's worth. Address all our scanning arrays, passive and active, at what the Lord Commander calls that blip and have a data stream to my console. But what is it? Asked Mask. It's a ship, my dear General, said Garan, one of ours. Chapter 20. Ardermantua, orbital. The ship emerged from the elemental furies surrounding Ardermantua, rising out of the radioactive soup and lashing ocean of charged particles like a wreck brought up from the seabed. Streams of energy and magnetic backwash, lurid and phosphorescent, spilled back into the pulsing blister of gravitational madness encasing the planet. The ship rose, powered by its own half-failing engines, summoned by the frantic hails from Kieran's ships, voices that gave it a direction to head in. It was ailing and damaged, they could see that. Many decks were blown out, and the hull was ruptured as though titanic battles had been waged on every level. At least one of its main engines was dead and bleeding clouds of lethal atomic blood into the vacuum. Two of Killen's most powerful cruisers, at the Admiral's direction, moved in closer to the struggling Revenant and secured tractor beams, slowly hauling back and assisting its desperate ascent from the cauldron of seething cosmological destruction. Identity? Asked Lord Commander Militant Heath. It's Aggressor class, my lord, said Curran, which means it has to be either the Amculon or the Ambraxes. They were the two Aggressor class cruisers assigned to the Chapter Master's undertaking. Keel number and all type broadcast codes confirm it is the Amculon, sir, a sensory officer announced. Let's raise her now she's clear of the backwash, said Kieran. He walked over to the main communication station where plugged-in operators and servitors worked at the steep banks of titanium keys. They looked as though they were attempting to play some nightmarishly complex cathedral pipe organ, out of which only the clacks and taps of their keys would issue. Connect me, said Kieran. Eerie squeals and screams suddenly blew up out of the Vox speakers, the ambient sound of space being tortured by radiation and gravity. Beeping and pulsing signals resolved out of the screams. Hololithic energies crackled around the cable-fed and rack-mounted hoop of the station's projector array, and then an image began to shimmer into place, suspended inside the rim of the hoop, like soapy water inside a child's bubble blower. There was a great deal of distortion. They could see a face, but it seemed like a face has seen through a white veil of mourning or some seer cloth for funereal binding. This is Admiral Kieran commanding the reinforcement squadron. I am speaking from the bridge of my vessel, the Azimuth. Amculon, can you hear me? Static, the moaning of vacuum ghosts. Amculon, Amculon, this is Azimuth. Can you hear me? It is my pleasure to confirm that I can, Admiral. A broken voice said from the projector and the speakers. We thought we were lost. Lost forever. This is Amculon. This is Amculon. Shipmistress Aquilinia speaking. Aquilinia? By the throne, it's good to hear your voice, said Kieran. Have you come to save us all, Admiral? That will be quite a feat. The brave fleet is gone. Our dementia is dying, and it is taking the last of our best along with it. Ship, Mistress, Heath said, stepping up beside Kieran. Forgive me. This is Lord Commander Militant Heath. I am commanding this task force that has come to reinforce and assist the Imperial Fists' effort here. My most honored lord, the pale half-seen phantom replied, I never expected that a man so great would come for us. Can you, shipmistress, account for the situation as you understand it? We have precious little data. Can you give any report, understand it? We have precious little data. Can you give any report? I have maintained my mission log since these events began, Aquilinia replied, the edges of her words shaved off by static. I will link the data directly to your cogitators so you may inload and review the information in full detail. To summarize, we were close to victory. The blister nest was under assault and Deuter fall. Ground forces had been dispatched, and others were preparing to drop. Then the noise bursts began. You will have heard those. First the noise bursts, then the gravitational anomalies. There were not supposed to be any hazards of that sort in this system, but they ripped through the planet's near space like a plague infection. One of them opened in my starboard drive and crippled us. Saved us, too. Explain, please, and, Coulon, instructed the Lord Commander Militant. It nearly brought us down. We had to drop our personnel and troop strengths by boat and teleport, but I managed to arrest our descent by ejecting the damaged core, and we were able to withdraw to a safer high anchor point above the planet where we began repairs. As a result, we were the only vessel a great deal further out when the full gravitational storm erupted. It destroyed the fleet, my lord. I saw ships torn apart and others fall on fire into the planet. I saw the Lanxium die. Great God Emperor, Hate whispered. We were far enough out to survive the worst of it, but we were caught inside the wash of the storm and blinded. All directional input was lost, sir. I could not move for fear of running directly into our dementia. I could not move until the sound of your voices showed me which direction was out. The battered Amculon was still pulling clear of the worst spatial distortion. Debris trailed out behind it, whipping back into the gravity well like silver dust. Resolution on the communication image was improving, and the Vox quality had got cleaner. The Ankelon was transporting Lotus Gate Company, said Mascar to the Lord Commander. Shipmistress, called Hate, did Lotus Gate Company get clear? Or are they still with you? At my instruction, she replied, they teleported to the surface. I personally gave Captain Severance the teleport locator wand so that I could recall them if the situation improved. But I lost all contact with the surface. Sir, I did not even know where the surface was. I have kept the locator's transmission signal on automatic recall, but I fear the captain and his wall are lost to us. They could see her on the hololith now. Her bridge was a charred ruin behind her. The image distortion had cleared somewhat, but part of what they had first taken as distortion remained. Shipmistress Aquilina and those members of her command crew who were in view were all swathed head to foot in white cloth. It was stained in patches as if pink fluid was gradually seeping out from within. Radiation burns, muttered Kieran. Sweet throne, I've never seen such extensive. They've shrouded themselves in protective veils, but they are burned so badly. Shit, mistress, Hate announced, we are sending rescue boats to you. Medicate teams will dash negative, she said. Her voice was quiet, but firm. We are thoroughly and lethally irradiated, my lord. All of us poisoned and scorched. We will not survive long. My entire ship is contaminated by the drive damage and utterly deadly. No one must come aboard. To board us is a death sentence. But, Hate protested. You have dragged us from the flames, sir. But we do not have long to live. Stay away. All I can do for you now is present my testament of events and convey all the information I have. I won't accept that ship, mistress, cried Hate. You must, my lord. A great disaster has overtaken the Imperial Fists here at Ardermantua. We can plainly see, said Kieran, a cosmic event, a gravitational hazard, but it is not natural, Admiral, said the shipmistress, through the Vox link. Say again? It is not a natural phenomenon. Ardermantua has not killed us all because of some whim of a universe. This effect is artificial. This location is under direct attack. Attack, echoed Mascar. By what? By the chromes, the xenoforms, asked Hate. I do not believe so, sir, answered Aquilina. There are alien voices in the noise bursts. Listen to them and watch the rising moon. Ardermantua has no moon, said Kieran. It does now, said the shipmistress. Chapter 21, Ardermantua, Orbital. That simply cannot be a moon, said the azimuth's first navigator, studying the large printout that had been unfolded on the silver display tables of the charting room. It is far, far too close to the planet itself. Look, it is within the very aura of the near-space disruption. That close, its gravitational effects would split our dimension in two. Am I honestly hearing this? Asked Hate. We have what appears to be best described as a full-blown gravity storm besetting this planet and coring up the heart of the system. Gravitational anomaly is all around the near-space region, and as you say, my lord, said the first navigator, I am quite precise. The gravitational incidents, the disruptions that we are seeing, are considerable. But it is random, and it seems to be manufactured by distortions in space. If a planetoid appeared in such close proximity to the world, it would be a much more focused and significant effect. Ardermantua would have shifted in its orbit, perhaps even been knocked headlong. The hazard we are encountering is like sustained damage from a shotgun. A moon? That would be a blow from a power hammer. But still, said Mascar, tapping his finger on the oddly shaded part of the printout, this. What is this? But still, said Mascar, tapping his finger on the oddly shaded part of the printout, this. What is this? An imaging artifact, said the first navigator. It's of considerable size, said Mascar. It's a considerably sized imaging artifact, then, sir. The Ampulon was an imaging artifact, too, Hate reminded them quietly. Then it turned out to be a ship. The physical laws of the universe would simply not permit a moon or other satellite body to move so close to a planet, nor could such a body appear. I've seen demons. Hate growled, up close. Don't talk to me about the physical laws of the universe. They stood in silence and stared down at the huge printout. The chart room was cool and well lit, arranged for the study of cosmological documents. The air circulator stirred the edges of a vast vellum sheet that hung over the edges of the silver table. None of the ships in Kieran's fleet had been able to detect or resolve anything resembling a moon in the gravitational and radioactive maelstrom surrounding Ardermantua. The printout image had come from the mission log data transmitted to them from the Ampulon. Aquilinia had recorded and stored the Orspec scan as she dragged her ship out of its death dive. This had been shortly before the tumult increased, swallowed her up, and blinded her. "We have examined the resolution," said one of the several tech adepts assembled in the chamber. "The so-called moon image is indeed a ghost. Verifiable data is hard to find, of course, but that object seems to be only partly material, as if it is an echo of something not quite there." "An imaging artifact," the first navigator declared. "No, sir," said the tech adept. "It is like something trying to emerge, to pass through, to translate, as if, through a warp gate, hell's teeth," cried Hate. "Then who or what are we dealing with?" "I don't know," said Admiral Kieran, "but I place my full-throated support behind your efforts to pursue this, sir, rather than giving it up as a dismal and lost cause. We must find out what is happening here and who has wrought it, because if they can move a planetary body here, then they can pretty much move one anywhere and do anything." Chapter 22. Terror. The Imperial Palace. The meeting done, Venin dismissed the 4 interrogators. They rose from their seats, bowed to her, raised their hoods, and left the tower-top chamber. The inquisitorial representative sat alone with her thoughts for a while. There were documents and advisories to review, and her rubricator had been urging her to annotate the latest watch list. Time enough for all of that later. The morning's news had been grim, pretty much exactly what she'd been anticipating, but grim. Her masters in the 3 subdivisions of the Inquisition expected much of her, and they had set her in a place among the 12 to accomplish a great deal. But it was a complicated dance, a matter of balance and timing. The Inquisition was an instrument of the Imperium. It did not set imperial policy. Unless it knew best, in which case it could not be seen to set imperial policy. Venin's quarters were an 8-level suite in the armored crown of a tower overlooking Bastion Ledge and the Water Gardens. There was not much of a view because of the tower's ample fortification. Agents of the Inquisition had added defenses of a more specialized nature when the tower was acquired for the representatives' use. The very walls and the armor glass of the windows were threaded with protective wards, woven from molecular silver fibers, and potent runes had been discreetly worked into the patterns of decorative ornamentation on the carpets and ceilings. Automatic weapon arrays and intruded denial systems had been retrofitted into every staircase, doorway, and floor space, and most of the servitors were wired for weapon activation at a moment's notice. The suite was cloaked in addition by multiple counter-surveillance fields and several more exotic effects derived from the esoteric arts that the Inquisition both practiced and guarded against. A cone of silence, psychically generated, yet psychically opaque, covered the uppermost stories, and there was even a Mars-built engine-rated void shield in the tower core that could be activated by voice command. Venin rose to her feet. She was dressed in a simple full-length gown of pale gray wool. Her rosette adorned her wrist as a bracelet. She felt Shred summon her rubricator and begin the day's correspondence, but she was enjoying the solitude, the calm emptiness of the room. She walked to the side table beside her desk and poured herself a glass of water from the fluted crystal jug, wishing her mind would as clear as the cool water. She raised the glass to her lips. There really could be anything in that, you know. Venin tried not to react. She maintained a composure with an extraordinary, invisible effort. Without sipping, she set the glass down again and returned to her seat at the desk without making any eye contact, or any outward show that there should be anything troubling in the fact that Dracum Van Garrick was suddenly sitting in one of the seats vacated by the interrogators. "Such as?" she asked, moving some papers. "Oh, Toxins, said Vangerich. I hear toxins are very popular. Untraceable, of course. Not necessarily lethal, but certainly mood-altering or behavior-modifying. Toxins that make you compliant and suggestible. Toxins that render you open to auto-hypnotic implanting, all sorts of things. I see. Don't you have a taster, an official taster? I thought you would have a person like you. I'll recruit one if it makes you happy, she said. I'm only concerned for you. For a friend. She looked at him directly. He was smiling, and the smile did not sit well with his scar. Why, did you place a toxin in my water, Draken? He shook his head. Throne, no, why would I? What an awful thought. He paused and looked her in the eyes. But I could have done. Anyone could have done. That's my point. No one could have Draken. Why is that? He asked sweetly. Because no one, she broke off. Because no one can get in here, he asked. Well, I seem to put the lie to that. He rose to his feet. You really are the most composed person, Veen, and applause for that, not even the courtesy of Miles' surprise at finding me here. I should not be surprised, she said. Even though your security advisor told you that this suite had a triple acquire secure rating that nothing short of a Primarch could get past, she didn't blink. I was quoting directly from his written report submitted for your approval 9 months ago. I know, page 18, line 24, if you say so. Quite a colorful turn of phrase, nothing short of a Primarch. Oh, not terribly technical. I agree. And not terribly accurate, he said. I noticed. I'd sack him if I were you. Draken, she said, done with his games, I'm impressed. All right. Does that satisfy you? I'm impressed that you got in here without setting off any alarm or countermeasure. It is almost inhumanly chilling that you were able to do so. Thank you, he replied, for what it's worth when it comes to the private palace apartments of the High 12. This is by far the hardest to get into. He looked at her and affected an expression of innocence. So I'm told, he said. I presume you came here for a purpose, she said. He sat down again, leaned back and crossed his legs. I presume, he echoed, that you read the transcripts this morning. In particular, she asked. He sighed. You're really going to make me work for it, aren't you? He asked. The first intercepts are back from Hate's valiant rescue mission. Ardermantua is a mess. Worse than could be imagined, for sheer scale of the loss isn't yet reckoned, nor is the true nature of the threat. But it's bad news. Yes, I saw that, Veenan replied. You're very calm about it, he observed. There's no point panicking, she answered. There's every point making a considered and rational response. It is a threat. A severe threat. Just as you originally suggested, he said. That's why I thought I'd come and have a little word with you. You used me, slightly, Veenan. You used me to move against Lansung in the Senatorum. That's fine, I quite enjoyed it. It's nice to feel wanted. You were concerned about the threat, because no one seemed to be taking it particularly seriously, but you were far more concerned with Lansung and his power block of allies, and the way the threat and others like it might be mishandled by them. It was a political maneuver to realign the High Lords. That's how you sold it to me. Agreed. So, the threats. Very, very real, Veenan. It's not a valid excuse for brokering. It's a palpable problem. And I think you knew it was when you co-opted me. What does the Inquisition know that the rest of us don't? I was concerned with Ransung's high-handed attitude towards Bangerich raised a hand. There is a threat to the Imperium that is of far greater magnitude than anyone imagines, but the Inquisition is reluctant to disclose it. Instead, the Inquisition attempts to use political subterfuge to alter Imperial doctrine and policy. Not so, she said. One would hope not. All that might be regarded very badly. The Inquisition taking over effective control of Imperial policy. There's a word for that. A word? The word is cool. Draken, she said, you're beginning to frustrate me with your paranoia. The Inquisition is not attempting to mount a political coup from within the Senatorum. Well, he replied, it would seem to be one thing or the other. Either the Inquisition is trying to take control because it knows something the rest of us don't, or you really are very concerned at the fitness of Lansum and his kind to sit at the high table. She said nothing. What is the threat, Venant? It is. What it is? What is the nature of the threat? You know as much as I do, Grandmaster. It is a Xenos threat that requires attention. He rose again. So you are sticking to your story. This is all about your concern about power balance and the fitness of Lanzung, Udo, and the others to rule? She nodded. Well, that rather makes it my problem, then, doesn't it? An issue for my officio? What do you mean? She asked, with a slight note of anxiety. Well, if any High Lord is deemed by his peers to be unfit or unworthy, the ultimate sanction has always been the officio access in autumn. It's why we exist. It is our purview. Political subterfuge is entirely a waste of time when you have the officio to clean house. Bangerich, don't be medieval. He leaned on her desk and stared into her face. Then I suggest you start trusting me, he said. Tell me the nature of this threat. Share it with all of us. Tell me what is so terrible. What scares the Inquisition so much it needs to take control of Imperial policy? What do you know? She stared back at him and hesitated. Then she said, there's nothing. Nothing to tell. He stood up straight. I see, he said. I see. If that's all you'll say, I see I must take you at your word. I suppose I'd better get about my business. What does that mean? She asked. Dracum, what are you suggesting? He walked to her side table, picked up the glass of water she had poured, and drank it down. I'm not suggesting anything, he said. I am going about my business and performing the duties entrusted to me. He walked towards the door. Dracum, she called after him, don't do anything. Don't do anything foolish. Please. The situation is very sensitive. This moment you mustn't act rashly. I'll try not to, he replied. But if no one tells me where the sensitivities lie, I cannot help but step on them. Can I? The door opened, and Venan's bodyguard Calthro strode in, a pistol raised. He halted when he saw Vangerich. Far too little? Vangerich told him as he strode past far too late. Chapter 23. Ardermantua daylight led the way over the broken ridge and down into the rubble-strewn valley where the lake spread out under a black sky. His armor and the plate armor of the other 3 Imperial Fists were spattered with ichor. No one had made any attempt to clean it off. They had left the field on the other side of the ridge, strewn with dead Xenos, piled high. It had plainly astonished Major Nyman and the Asmati troopers, who had moved in towards the end and helped to slay the last few dozen with targeted fire. Gravity, shifting and flexing like an invisible serpent through earth and air, shattered a distant row of hills with a noise like thunder. The clouds boiled past overhead on fast play, flames of red, green, and yellow danced around the ridges of broken rock and upturned split earth. Once we reached the lake, then what? Asked Bastion Leg. From a lake, the nest, replied Daylight. Then? Bastion Lord asked. Then we look for survivors, replied Daylight. 4 signs. And if we find none, we look elsewhere. And if more of those things appear, Bastion Ledge asked, then we kill more of those things, said Daylight. They skirted a series of murky pools and crooked ponds that were offshoots of the lake, their trudging figures reflected in the water, the running sky behind them. The wind blew. The noise burst, continued to break the air, howling barks that came from everywhere and nowhere. The gravity blister popped without any warning except a slight shrug of physical matter. A random anomaly, it opened on the edge of one of the pools about 50 meters from their procession. The physicality of the world, the rocks, the air, and the pool altered instantly. It went off like a bomb, hurling tons of stone and soil into the air sideways like a blizzard. The ground broke open and water turned to steam. The main volume of the pool surged in the opposite direction in a spontaneous tidal wave, 3 meters tall, and broke across the next ridge with enough force to shatter rock. Flying rocks and debris along with mud and water ripped along the line of Daylight's party. The guardsmen were knocked off their feet. One died, his head crushed by a boulder. Only the frail, mind-addled tech adept, bewildered and confused, remained upright. Rocks and stones rained off the Imperial Fists, pelting their armor. In that instant, Daylight once again felt the uneasy fear. The Imperial Fists excelled at holding ground, but how did a warrior do that when the ground itself couldn't be trusted? The thought barely had time to form before another blister ripped the world open. It was smaller than the first, a gravitic aftershock, but it was right under them. 2 of the Asmodees simply atomized, turning into clouds of blood and whizzing armor shreds, their forms lost in the explosive upchuck of rock and bludgeoning concussion. Bastion Ledge died, too. As the smoke and steam cleared, and the last of the rock debris rained down and skidded around them as the ground stopped shaking, Daylight saw his wall brother. Half of Bastion Ledge, most of the left-hand side of his body, was missing. It was folded and compressed in on itself, flesh, bone, and armor alike. It looked as though he had been snatched up by a giant and squeezed until he was crushed like a tin cup. Black blood drenched his buckled, ruined war gear. Zarathustra knelt beside him to check for vitals, but they all knew it was in vain. Bastion was gone, killed by the world, killed by the ground, killed by the forces of nature they ought to have been able to trust. For a second, Daylight felt hopelessness, but there was no time to consider such luxuries as emotions. A third gravity blister blew out on the far side of the valley and the boom rolled around the outcrops. It hardly mattered. There was a more immediate threat. Major Neiman was shouting. He dripped his helmet off so he could be heard, and he was yelling, gasping in the thin air. Daylight turned. Chromes were coming out of the stretch of lake behind them, scrambling towards the shore. They were all large, dark, mature, and powerful. Flying rocks hurled by the third gravity detonation hammered across the lake, killing several of them, and sending up spouts of water as though heavy-caliber gunfire were peppering the surface. The Chromes churned on regardless, bounding up the stony shore to attack the Imperial party. Neiman and his men began to fire, though some of the Asmodei was still dazed from the triple hammer blow of the gravity blisters. Zarathustra sprang up and charged down the slope into the water, impaling first one, and then a second dark chrome with his war spear. He felt a third with a savage back thrust of the spear's half, and then threw himself full length to tackle a chrome in the shallows that was bearing down on Major Neiman. Neiman's repeated shots were not slowing it down. Zarathustra knocked the creature sideways and then tangled into a wrestling brawl with it, kicking up sprays of froth and water. Tranquility used his bolt gun as he moved down the shore, picking off 2 more of the chromes that had come too close to the Azamati line. His mass-reactive shells stopped them dead in a way that the poor guardsmen's lacerrounds could not. It took sustained, saturating fire to stop a warrior form with a las rifle. Having bought enough time with his shots to get at the chrome's close quarters, Tranquility holstered his bolt and unsung the power hammer from his back plate. He crushed one chrome skull down into its shoulders and then struck another sideways into the shallows. Its cranium split and ichor sprayed out. A third, attacking the Imperial Fist furiously, was knocked back with a butt of a half, leaving it open for a downward smash of the head that ruptured it like a well-cooked piece of shellfish. Ichor stained the frothing surface of the lake at the shallows. Daylight met the attack with his gladius in his right hand and his combat knife in his left. He stabbed his sword through a sternum plate, then slashed a mouth and throat open with his knife. As his second kill fell back, Daylight used the combat knife to block the striking claws of a third chrome warrior form, shoved the creature's limbs up and aside, and ripped his sword through its exposed midriff with a sideways slash. A fourth chrome closed. Daylight outstepped its charge and hacked his sword edge into its spine as it passed him, dropping it onto its face into the pool. A fifth beast ran onto his extended knife, a sixth died from a crosscut, a double slash of both weapons that ran from shoulders to hips. A particularly large crone seized Daylight from behind, sawing into his armor with its claws, gnawing into his back plate with its mouth parts. It hoisted him off his feet, backwards, tilting. Daylight inverted his grip on both blades, letting them fall out of his hands so he could catch them again reversed, and then stabbed past either side of his hips with the sword and the knife, impaling the torso that was braced against his. The crone burst at the wound points and sprayed ichor. It collapsed, putting Daylight down with it into the water in a thrashing commotion. Others rushed at him, trying to rip into the Imperial Fists' wall brother before he could regain his footing. Zarathustra and some of the Asmodees saw this and moved to support. The guardsmen fired at the thrashing crumbs, and Zarathustra charged them, spear raised. Gunfire raked the surface of the pool, cutting down dozens of the crumbs. It resembled the fury of spume and spouts that had been kicked up by the rock debris, but it was real gunfire. Roto cannons. Tranquility turned. Zarathustra reached Daylight and hauled him upright, stabbing at the crumbs that tried to mob and menace them. Figures moved down the stony shore towards them. A squad of men. Two in the lead carried rotor cannons, firing bursts into the pool as they approached to drive back the xenoforms. They were Imperial Fists. Daylight crunched up the shoreline of the water to meet them, Zarathustra at his heels. The squad commander faced them and removed his helm. "Severance Captain, Lotus Gate Wall," he said. "Where did you come from?" Chapter 25. A dementia. They had been walking around the lake edge in the company of Severance's squad for several hours when they spotted the flare. It lofted up in the distance, and incandescently bright Pint Rick then shivered as it hung in place before fading and falling away, all effort spent. "One of mine," Severance cried. "Multh." They began to make the best pace possible. As the leaders ran ahead, Captain Severance told Daylight that his subdivided walls had agreed to use basic flares and visual signals to stay in contact, given that everything up to and including short range, helm-to-helm box was useless. The ragged Asmodai troopers couldn't keep up. Major Nyman had put his helmet back on, exhausted by the impure air, but rather more troubled by the constant noise bursts. Even those Asmodai who had kept their visors of their orbital drop suits firmly sealed since planetfall were feeling the effects. The noise bursts echoed into the cavities of their helmets and armor, unsettling them. It was psychologically hammering them. Severance pointed to 4 of his men and told them to stay with the guardsmen and bring them along behind. Then he set out at full pace. It took them half an hour to reach the origin of the signal flare. Daylight was beside Severance as they slowed to approach. It was a second search party from Lotus Gate Wall commanded by a sergeant called Diligent. "Good to see you, sir," the sergeant called out. He hesitated as he saw Daylight and the other space marines new to him. "I see you've made discoveries of your own," he remarked. "What did you find?" asked Severance. "A blister nest, or what's left of it," said Diligent. "And survivors." The survivors of the original undertaking assault had taken shelter in the ruins of the blister nest, using its structure to weather out the worst the gravity storms threw at them. They had, in the week since, constructed a makeshift stockade from boulders, wreckage, and parts of the nest structure. Inside the jagged walls there were men from Ballot Gateway, Hemispheric, Anterior 6 Gate, and Daylight Walls, about 130 of them all told, together with a few fragile servitors. There was no substantial equipment, no heavy weapons or vehicles with them, and precious little munitions supply. First Captain Algarin of Hemispheric had command. "We met in bad days," he said to Severance and Daylight. He looked at Daylight, and at Tranquility and Zarathustra nearby. "You left the walls unguarded to comfort us? I'm not sure I approve." "You're not the first person to express that thought, Captain," said Daylight. "We made our choice." The chapter was beset. "Worse than beset," said Algarin. His voice dropped. "Worse than beset." He looked at the ground. His armor was almost black with filth, and he showed hundreds of nicks and gouges from chrome claws. The chapter master is dead, he said, aiming each word like a lashbolt at the ground. He reached the surface by teleport before the flagship was lost. He came to us. He was with us for 3 weeks. Chromes took him. Rent him. There were 300 of us then. They wear us down, but are so many of them. A tradition, the coward's tactic. Algerine looked at them. He was so angry, he said. Mirren, such a great man, but so angry. He railed at the gods, at the stars, to see his fleet wrecked and his chapter shredded, and the honor that has carried us through at the forefront of all chapters since the very start, shredded away by animals, by vermin and a crooked planet. He took a breath. They killed him because of his anger, you know, he said. He wanted to kill them. He wanted to kill them all, but there were too many. I tried to pull him back. Algerine stopped. He looked at Daylight. You have brought ships to take us off here, Warbrother, he asked. I have, replied Daylight. But conditions are still bad. We have to devise a way for them to get close enough to effect evac. I don't think conditions will improve, said Algerine. Not anytime soon. He looked up as Severance's men brought the Asmodai stragglers into the makeshift fortification. Men, he said, unimpressed. They will not last long. We had about 50 auxiliaries with us at the start. The noises drove them mad in the first week. We had to, it wasn't a good situation. Only one of them survived. I suspect it's because he was scatterbrained to begin with. He's determined, though I'll give him that. Determined to puzzle it out? What do you mean? Asked Daylight. See for yourself? Algerine invited. He's with one of yours. I am Slaughter, said the second captain of Daylight Wall Company. I am Daylight, said Daylight. I'm glad of a sight of you, said Slaughter. You came for us. That won't be forgotten. Daylight nodded. I am heartened to hear that sentiment from one mouth at least. Who is your charge here? He asked. A bedraggled and filthy human in ragged robes was hunkered in the corner of the nest chamber, working at various pieces of Imperial apparatus. The devices stacked and piled against the chamber wall, many of them damaged, were running off battery power. Several of them had clearly been customized, refitted, or repurposed. He is the major astrologist sent to accompany our mission, Slaughter explained. The chamber was gloomy and dank, part of the surviving underground burrows of a blister nest. Water dripped from the organic arch of the roof. He was supposed to steady the xenoforms while we killed them. I was set to guard him when our fortunes changed. I'd been doing that ever since, pretty much. They approached the scientist. He was intent on his work, muttering to himself. He was in need of a decent shave. His hair, dirty and unruly, had been clipped back in a bunch, using the bent clasp of an ammunition pack. His name is Laurentiis, said Slaughter. Majos, said Daylight, crouching beside the Major's biologists. Magus? I am Daylight. Laurentiis looked at him for a moment. Oh. A new one, he said. You're new. He's new, Slaughter. See there? I'm beginning to tell you apart. He smiled. Noise burst, echoed outside the chamber, and Laurentiis winced and rubbed his ears roughly with the grind knuckles. The wavelength is changing, it's changing, today, and these last few days. Greater intensity. Yes, greater intensity. The major spyologist looked at them as if they might understand. I had specialist equipment, he said. I was sent by the chapter master, himself. He paused and thought, his eyes darkening. He's dead now, isn't he? Yes, said Slaughter. Well, yes. Sad. Anyway, before that happened, him dying, he sent me equipment. I asked him for it. Specialist equipment. I asked for it, you see. But so much of it was damaged before I could use it. Everything went a bit crazy. Yes, a bit crazy. The Majors believed from the very outset, Slaughter said to Daylight, but the noise burst to the form of communication. He wanted to decipher them. A drop of specialist equipment to allow him to do that was arranged, but it had been overrun by chromes and half scrapped by the time we got to it. Communications, said Daylight. From the chromes. I thought so at first, said Laurentis, jumping up suddenly to stretch his cramping legs. Yes, I did. At first I thought we had underestimated the technical abilities of the Chrome first. I thought we had underestimated the technical abilities of the Chromes. I thought we had underestimated their sapiens. They might grate from world to world. That suggested a great capacity for another noise burst, a longer one, had just echoed through the darkness of the stockade and the ruined nest, and it had rather distracted him. What was I saying? He asked them, digging his knuckles into his ears. Stockade and the ruined nest, and it had rather distracted him. What was I saying? He asked them, digging his knuckles into his ears again and jiggling his head. Communication, prompted Daylight. He remembered very clearly what had been spoken of on the bridge of the azimuth. The noises coming from Ardar, read as organic, boosted and amplified for broadcast, but organic. Like a voice. You believe it's communication, he pressed. Yes, that's what I thought. That was my theory. And it seemed a valid one. I thought the Chromes were trying to surrender or negotiate peace. That's what I thought at first. Do you remember me saying that, Slaughter? I do, Major, said Slaughter. Then I thought they might be trying to compose a challenge. Then I thought they might be warning us, warning us not to mess with them. Then I thought they might be trying to warn us about something else. Like what? Asked Daylight. Well, said Laurentis, it doesn't much matter because I don't believe it is them at all anymore. Do I, Slaughter? You don't, said Slaughter. I think it's someone else. Yes, that's what I think. Someone else. The Major's biologists looked at them both. What do you think? He asked. I think I'd like you to explain more, said Daylight. Who do you think this someone else is? Laurenti shrugged. Ooh, someone very advanced, he said. Very advanced. Take gravity, for example. They are very, very advanced in that field. Gravitic engineering. Imagine they're shifting something, and this world, it's just the delivery point. What are they shifting? Something very big, said Laurentis. A moon? Asked Daylight. Slaughter looked at him sharply. It could be a moon. Yes, it could be, said Laurentis. You've seen the reflection in the lake, have you? I have, said Daylight. Whatever it is, it's still in transition. If it's a moon or a planetoid, well, throne save us all. That's a different class of everything. I mean, we can terraform, we can even realign small planetoids in system, but shifting planetary bodies on an interstellar range. That's godlike. There are rumors, of course, stories, myths. They say that the ancients, the precursor races, they say they had power of that magnitude, even the Eldar once at the very peak of their culture, but not anymore. No one can do that anymore, not on that scale. Except whoever the voice belongs to, asked Daylight. Yes, well, perhaps, said Laurentis. And who does the voice belong to, asked Daylight. Noises boomed and howled. Laurentis scrambled at his ears again like a man with head lice and pulled a pained face. That's the real trick, isn't it? He agreed, knowing that thing. We have to translate the words first and find out what they were saying. Maybe they're introducing themselves to us. Maybe this is a contact message. Hello. I spent 6 weeks trying to figure that out. He made a sweeping gesture that encompassed his makeshift pile of devices and equipment. 6 weeks, working with these items, which are hardly ideal. It's so hard to jury-rig what I'm missing. The parsing cogitators are a particular loss, and the vocalization monitors. I've made do with quite a lot, actually quite a lot, but thrown alive what I wouldn't give for a decent grade tech servitor, or a Vox servitor, or an augmatic receiver. Cranial implants? I never took them myself, you see. If this is contact, asked Daylight. It's surely hostile. Loran is nodded, blinking away. Another noise burst with a shake of his head. I mean, definitely. But it would still be worth hearing what it had to say for itself. You would confirm a hostile intent then. I don't have to, Loran is exclaimed. Look at the rats. The rats? Asked Daylight. No, not rats. The crumbs. That's what I mean. The crumbs. Like rats. You could gather so much data by observing the behavior patterns and habits of animals. Rats? Remember when I first called them rats, Slaughter? Remember that? I do, Majors, said Slaughter. I said it as a joke at first, said Laurentius. I said it because their behavior reminded me of rat behavior. Rats suddenly turning hostile and flooding into a new area with great and uncharacteristic aggression. It can be very scary, very dangerous. They're not a threat. They live under the floorboards and in the walls for years, never harming anyone, and then they are turned into a threat. Turned into one. How? Asked Daylight. Because they are threatened by a greater natural predator, something they fear. Yes, fear enough to make them attack things they would not normally attack, in this case, the Imperium. And Space Marines, goodness me, the Chromes are just animals, they are just vermin, they're rats, you see, we're fighting them because they've been driven into our zones of space by something they do not want to be around. They are fleeing for their lives, and it's made them desperate enough to battle us. He looked at them both. It makes sense, doesn't it? He asked, pleased with himself. He grinned. Daylight noticed that at some point several of the Major's biologist's teeth had been knocked out. The gap he smiled made him look more like an eager child than a credible expert. If the animals, how are they traveling between worlds? Asked Daylight. How are they affecting interstellar and void transport? The Rentist clapped his hands and did a little jig. That's another thing you see. You see, that's sort of what clinches it because it neatly answers the other mystery. How do the crumbs get from world to world? How do they migrate? What explains their diaspora? Nothing. They can't do it. They're animals. QED. Something is bringing them here. They're moving through the tunnels. The tunnels? Asked Daylight. Yes. Tunnels. There's probably a better word for it. I haven't really worked this material up into a presentation form yet. Tunnels will have to do. The tunnels, built by whoever the voice belongs to. He looked at Slaughter, and then Daylight, then back to Slaughter. Whoever owns the voice, he said quietly, as though someone might overhear, is equipped with a highly superior tech level. They can manipulate, at a fundamental level, gravity and other primary forces of the universe. They can, so it would appear, reposition planetary bodies over interstellar distances. They do this by constructing tunnels. Let's use that word, tunnels through space, perhaps through the warp itself as we understand it, not that we really understand it, mind, or through some closely associated stratum of subspace. Perhaps a gravitational sublayer, or even a teleportational vector. I can't really be sure yet. So let's simply settle on the term subspace tunnel, shall we? Now the Chromes, they're vermin, you see, pests. They live in that subspace realm we're talking about, like rats live in an attic or a sewer. The subspace realm is an attic of the universe we don't ever see. A cosmic sewer. And as the owner of the voice moves through that attic, subspace realm, are you still with me? As the owner of the voice does that, it drives them ahead of it. The Chromes are spread indirectly, said Daylight, via the transportational rifts constructed by this unknown xenoform. Very well put, Lawrence exclaimed. Can I write that down? Like rats in an attic that's on fire, the Chromes are being driven out ahead of the flames, fighting anything that gets in their way. Or like rats in a sewer, where there are big lizards of some sort and the big lizards are trying to eat them, so they're afraid, and they're running away from the big lizards, and I get it, said Daylight. Calm yourself, Majors. He looked over at Slaughter. We very much need to find out what's coming, Captain, he said. Slaughter nodded. It's not going to be pretty when it arrives, said Laurentius, quieter now. It's an immense threat. The Chromes may be pests and essentially non-sentient, but they are durable and resilient and highly numerous, and their entire population whole nests, whole family communities. Millions strong is being forced to flee for past sex across the galaxy through the cellars and chimneys of space. He paused. Just like rats. Daylight was thinking. Did you say, he asked the Major's biologist suddenly, that you needed a servitor? What about Attack Adept? Would Attack Adept do? And so, we come to the end of Chapter 25 in The Beast Arises, I Am Slaughter. The stakes have never been higher for the Imperial Fists as they fight desperately to hold the line against an enemy they are only beginning to understand. The Chromes, once thought to be a manageable threat, have proven themselves far more dangerous and cunning, and the gravity of the situation has taken its toll on the Imperial forces, both on Ardermantua and in the void above. We've witnessed fierce battles, the unraveling of political schemes, and the growing realization that this is no ordinary conflict. With every chapter, the true scale of the danger facing the Imperium becomes clearer, and as we approach Chapter 26, it's certain that the worst is yet to come. But for now, we leave Captain Slaughter, the Imperial Fists, and the halls of power on Terra to reflect on the challenges ahead. Will the Imperium's finest warriors find a way to turn the tide of this war? Or will the Chrome's unknown masters reveal a threat far greater than anyone could have anticipated? We'll continue this journey in the next installment, where Chapter 26 will take us deeper into the heart of this epic tale of war, survival, and betrayal. Until then, thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Warhammer 40K universe. Your support, comments, and theories are what keep us going, and we can't wait to dive back into the story with you soon. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the continuation of this epic saga. And as always, share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think will happen next? Could the Chromes have more surprises in store for the Imperial Fists? Until next time, remember,